In Harlem, mention the word extortion and most folks will tell you about the preacher crew. They went by other names too, the family, the Black Hand of Death, but no matter what you called them, everybody knew they were the most feared men in the game. Their hustle was simple, but deadly. Shake down drug dealers across the country, and if you didn't pay, you'd pay in blood. They had bodies tied to them going back to the 70s, and their methods were straight cold. If they ordered a hit, they'd burn off tattoos with acid so nobody could ID the body, then chop it up and stash it in some abandoned building. After every kill, the crew would scrub the scene with boric acid like it was routine, and at the top of it all sat one man, Clarence Heatley. Now, Clarence Heatley was born in 1953 right in the heart of New York City. He grew up in Harlem, a tough neighborhood in the northern part of Manhattan. School? Yeah, that wasn't really his thing. He dropped out in the 4th grade. By the time he was just 9, he'd already found himself in juvenile detention. As the years went by, he shot up to an intimidating 6'7" and picked up the nickname Preacher. But on the streets, people didn't call him that out of respect for any sermon. No, they knew him as something far darker, the Black Hand of Death. In 1983, Heatley pulled together a crew that would go down in Harlem's underworld history, the Preacher Crew. This wasn't some ragtag bunch. It was a stacked roster: John Big Cuz Cuff, Derek Hailstock, Paul Nutsy Weller, Raymond Jerry Woo Jackson, and others. At first, they moved white powder through the city, quietly and under the radar, but it didn't take long before they expanded into crack, heroin, and PCP. Drugs weren't their only hustle either. They kidnapped rivals, extorted dealers, and handled problems with deadly precision. Under Heatley's leadership, the crew turned into a multi-million-dollar empire. Dealers were paying him $20,000 to $30,000 just for the privilege of being left alone. On top of that, the kidnapping side of the business alone was believed to pull in around $1 million a year. They even worked as hired killers for other gangsters, charging $5,000 a hit, only to sometimes turn around and rob or kill the very people who paid them, because in Preacher's eyes, anyone who needed someone else to handle their dirt was weak. One of Heatley's most trusted men was John Big Cuz Cuff, a former cop from the New York City Housing Authority Police Department. They first crossed paths in 1983, when Cuff was still on the force, but already moonlighting for Heatley as a driver and muscle. After a robbery arrest and a failed drug test, Cuff was suspended. Not long after, he beat a murder charge in Baltimore when a witness switched their story. By then, he was already Heatley's bodyguard, enforcer, and, as some on the street put it, his personal assassin. Cuff was known for strangling his targets, something he reportedly enjoyed. Alongside men like military veteran Anthony Boatwright, Cuff helped Heatley run the streets with no real limits. In New York's criminal ecosystem, they were apex predators. The Preacher Crew operated under strict rules: no snitching, no fighting each other, no stealing from the crew, and no drugs for personal use. Breaking those rules brought swift and brutal punishment: beatings, lashings, and sometimes execution. Heatley ran his crew with an iron grip, personally making sure punishments were carried out when someone stepped out of line. His main turf was around 144th and 8th Avenue in Manhattan, but he also owned an apartment building on the Bronx's Grand Concourse, a place with a far darker purpose. Down in its basement, people were tortured, and some never came out alive. By the 1990s, he'd shifted his base to another Bronx apartment building, this time living there with his girlfriend. On the surface, he looked like just another landlord running a legit business. In reality, it was the command center of his crack and cocaine empire, which hit its peak from 1990 to 1996. Known to some as the Family, the crew truly was a family operation. Heatley's son, daughter, and girlfriend all had their part in keeping the empire running, but Harlem had no idea that another player's story was about to crash into Preacher's, sparking one of the most brutal chapters in its history. Now, Richard Thomas Porter was born on November 10, 1964, to Velma Porter in Harlem, New York City. The oldest of 3 children with a sister named Patricia and a brother named Donnell, he grew up in the legendary Sugar Hill area on Harlem's west side. From early on, Rich, as most people called him, was built for the hustle. At just 9 years old, he was already making his own money bagging groceries and selling newspapers. By 12, he was hustling, selling marijuana joints for $1 and running a clever little scam, passing off eggs and sage as illegal hash. At 16, he rolled up in his very first car, a BMW. Soon he moved on to selling powder cocaine with the flashy brand name Much Better, posted up on the corner of 145th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. Later, he teamed up with a dealer named LA, shifting their business over to 144th Street. By his 20s, Rich was living the high life, more than a dozen luxury cars, closets stacked with designer clothes, and a reputation for never wearing the same outfit twice. Born into a world with few opportunities and deep economic inequality, Rich embraced the crack game fully. His first real trouble with the law came in 1984 when he caught charges for a shootout, weapons possession, and later a drug charge, serving a year behind bars. Before linking up with Alpo Martinez and Ozzy Faison, Rich was tight with LA, hanging out in Harlem hotspots like Willie Burgers and the Rooftop. After LA was killed at the Rooftop, Rich found himself rolling with Alpo, the soon-to-be infamous government informant, and his old friend Ozzy. Alpo's own journey in the game started back in 1980 on a street corner, later crossing paths with AZ at the historic Rucker Park. Alpo asked for a spot in AZ's crew, and AZ brought him in. One day, while AZ was out shopping for his mother's Volvo, he spotted Alpo eyeing an Isuzu Impulse on the showroom floor and bought it for him. $18,000 cash, just like that. Around that same time, Rich reconnected with AZ after finishing his prison bid. Back then, Harlem was like a family. Money was flowing, people looked out for their own, and even the neighboring Queens crews came through for basketball games in the park. Rich was pulling in around $50,000 a week moving heroin, cocaine, and crack. AZ focused on cocaine and heroin while Alpo and Rich sold it all. With Alpo as muscle, they were untouchable. Stories floated around that Teddy Riley approached Rich in Virginia Beach for funding, and Rich handed him the money, allegedly helping spark the New Jack Swing movement. In those days, money, cars, and popularity were all part of the game. Even some cops were on payroll, allowing certain dealers to keep their territory in exchange for cash. By 1986, the trio was moving serious weight, up to 5 kilos of cocaine a day, chopped down into $10 deals. Business was booming so much, they started running operations out of storefronts, pulling in over $100,000 every single week. Ozzy even opened his own arcade, the Jukebox, right on 145th Street. Meanwhile, Rich and Alpo were out flexing in matching Porsche 944S. And Rich? He kept his signature move, never wearing the same outfit twice. But with all that flash came danger. The smartest dealers bought houses far from the city, keeping their business and personal lives separate. Rich, with his flamboyant style, was loved by many, but envied by more. In a game where jealousy runs deep, some people didn't want to see him succeed. As the money rolled in, so did the trouble. Tougher laws meant more people behind bars, and the streets turned bloodier with every fight over territory and grudges. Harlem, once lively and close-knit, felt like it changed overnight. Cold, dangerous, and full of fear. Dealers vanished, families were hunted, and the game started looking less like a hustle and more like a death sentence. By 1989, tragedy hit home for Rich Porter when his 12-year-old little brother, William Donald, went missing on his way to PS 92. To the family, Donald wasn't just the youngest, he was the heart, the bright hope they prayed would escape the streets that had swallowed so many. Rich guarded him fiercely, hoping he'd grow up untouched by the game. That hope cracked when 4 p.m. came and went with no sign of Donald. Velma, their mother, walked to the school only to find out her boy never made it there. An hour later, the phone rang. Donald's small voice cried out, saying they had him and he didn't know why. Then the line went dead. Not long after, the threats came. If the family called the cops, it would get worse. The kidnappers turned out to be someone far too close, Donald's uncle, Alpo, and his partner Preacher. At first, they demanded $500,000 for Donald's return, but when his father said he couldn't pay, they dropped it to $350,000. The next day, the horror deepened. The family was told to go to a McDonald's on 125th and Broadway. In the men's bathroom, they found a coffee cup holding Donald's severed index finger, 2 rings, and a cassette tape. On the tape, his trembling voice begged for help, saying they'd cut his finger off and would take his hand next if the ransom wasn't met. He told his mother he loved her, told his sister the same, and then came the sound of a boy sobbing. By that night, Rich told the kidnappers he only had $200,000 in cash. They said they'd call back in 10 minutes. They never did. Hours later, after much debate, the family finally called the police. Days later, a child delivered a note saying they still wanted the money and that Donald was in pain and needed medical attention. While all this was happening, Alpo Martinez was making his moves, linking with dealers from DC and buying kilos from Rich. But according to Alpo, Rich was flipping them for double and keeping the difference. Whether that was the truth or Alpo's version of it, one thing's certain: it made him furious. On January 3rd, 1990, Alpo and another DC dealer, Gary, murdered Rich in cold blood, shooting him in the head and chest. His body was dumped in the bushes near Orchard Beach Park with $2,239 still in his pocket. The next day, NYPD knocked on Velma Porter's door. They told her one of her sons had been found dead. At first, they thought it might be Donald, but it was Rich. The family buried him on January 10th, still holding on to some fragile hope that Donald might be alive. That hope was crushed just weeks later. On January 28th, Donald's body turned up in City Island, less than a mile from where Rich had been killed. His remains had been stuffed into 14 black garbage bags. The news hit Harlem like a punch to the gut, leaving the whole community shattered. Alpo headed down to DC, but here's the thing about the streets. They've got a long memory. In the early hours of November 7th, 1991, the FBI and DC police finally closed in on him. Then came December 19th, 1991, the day it all came crashing down. In a federal courtroom in Alexandria, Virginia, Alpo Martinez was hit with charges that could lock a man away forever: conspiracy, weapons violations, money laundering, running a continuing drug enterprise, and most chilling of all, 14 counts of murder. Prosecutors painted him as the man behind a cocaine pipeline stretching from New York to Fredericksburg, Virginia, flooding the DC area with over 500 kilos. The next day, Alpo sat in court as prosecutors tied him to the murders of Washington drug kingpin Michael Frey Salters, Timothy Cohen, and Mark Mullen, the last two executed in broad daylight at a Maryland car wash. He said almost nothing, just sniffled, holding back tears, staring at the reality of dying in prison or dying by execution. In the streets, there's a code: you don't talk. But with the walls closing in, Martinez made his choice. He flipped. In exchange for a lighter sentence, he gave up everything: 14 murders, the inner workings of his empire, and the names of people he once broke bread with. One of the murders he confessed to was the killing of his former friend and Harlem drug partner, Rich Porter. He said it started over money. Porter had been skimming $3,000 to $5,000 off every kilo he sold him. Martinez set up a meeting, making small talk to keep Porter calm as they drove. An accomplice shot Porter first, but when he didn't die, Martinez finished the job himself. They dumped the body on City Island in the Bronx, where it was found hours later. For Martinez, it wasn't personal, it was business. But even he admitted it cut deep, calling Porter a man he loved like a brother. That betrayal cemented his fall. In the end, he got 35 years in federal prison and disappeared into witness protection. But as for Heatley, it didn't take long for his drug empire to start crumbling. The law was closing in, and cracks were forming inside his own crew. His whole operation ran on fear: drug dealing, extortion, and a trail of bodies in their wake. That kind of heat was bound to bring the FBI and NYPD to his doorstep, and when they came hard. They leaned on informants, including one of Heatley's own former enforcers, Stanley "Squirt" McKenzie. Their testimonies painted a violent, bloody picture of the crew's business, making Heatley's downfall feel less like an if and more like a when. Then came the fallout between Heatley's top lieutenants, Cuff and Anthony Boatwright. Both secretly plotted against the other, but Heatley sided with Cuff. Boatwright, an ex-military janitor who cleaned up murder scenes, was becoming too bold, even threatening other members. On March 21st, 1994, Heatley and Cuff lured him into the basement of Heatley's Bronx building. Cuff shot him in the head, and the crew dismembered his body, burning his head and arms to erase tattoos before dumping the remains in an abandoned Manhattan building. Later, Heatley had the parts moved to make them disappear for good. By then, the FBI's C-11 squad, backed by the DEA, NYPD, and IRS, had the crew under a microscope, linking them to nearly 45 murders. When a crew member flipped, Heatley, Cuff, and two others tried snatching him outside a courthouse. Police intercepted their van, finding masks, pipes, duct tape, and rope, though charges didn't stick for that incident. On July 15, 1996, Heatley was indicted for 3 murders and racketeering conspiracy. Less than a month later, NYPD found him in the Bronx. In a twist of fate, he ended up in the same holding cell as Cuff, both arrested the same day, before being handed over to federal custody. When Heatley pulled up to the FBI offices at 26 Federal Plaza, agents wasted no time reading him his Miranda rights. He waived them without hesitation, ready to talk. Sitting across from FBI Special Agent David Higgins and NYPD Detective Vincent Flynn, Heatley got straight to the point. He wanted to know how he could help himself by cooperating. Higgins broke it down, explaining the whole cooperation process, the federal sentencing guidelines, and something called a 5K1 letter. They made it clear, no promises, just for talking. Flynn told him plain and simple, all they'd ever ask from him was the truth. For the next couple of hours, Heatley spilled, dropping statements that tied both himself and others to serious crimes. He kept circling back to his interest in cooperating, so the agents told him they'd pass everything he said to the U.S. attorney. The next morning, August 13th, Flynn called AUSA Sharon McCarthy, filling her in on Heatley's statements and his willingness to work with them. McCarthy went straight to her boss, Elizabeth Glazer, to share the news. Later that day, after Heatley's court appearance, McCarthy met with his lawyer, Andrew Shapiro. She laid it out. Heatley had been under investigation for a while, and the Fed saw him as the leader of a criminal enterprise, with crimes far beyond what the current indictment showed. Her goal was to make sure Shapiro understood the stakes and the dangers of entering a proffer session. She told him to follow up on Heatley's interest in cooperating, and Shapiro agreed to talk to his client. After speaking with Heatley, Shapiro confirmed he was serious about working with the government. By August 16th, he called McCarthy back, ready to discuss a deal, and they penciled in the first meeting for August 21st. Around that same time, Shapiro sent the indictment to Robert Gottlieb, an old lawyer of Heatley's, thinking he might want him back on the case. But after reviewing the charges and meeting Heatley at MCC, Gottlieb stepped aside, and Heatley chose to stick with Shapiro. On August 19th, Heatley reached out to Shapiro with two things on his mind. First, he wanted to share information about people he believed might be in danger, hoping it would show the government he was serious about cooperating. Second, he had some doubts, passed along by another lawyer, Gottlieb, about going into a proffer session. Gottlieb had warned him that prosecutor Sharon McCarthy wasn't a straight shooter, that Shapiro was making a mistake, and that no good lawyer would put a defendant in this kind of position because the U.S. Attorney's Office would just double-cross him and use legal aid to do it. Shapiro pushed back, telling Heatley that in his experience, McCarthy was trustworthy, their working relationship was solid, and he'd never seen the U.S. Attorney's Office pull a move like that. He reminded Heatley they were obligated to act in good faith. Still, Heatley worried McCarthy might not have enough pull inside the office to actually make a cooperation deal happen. Shapiro promised to involve her superiors, but admitted some of these concerns made him question whether to move forward at all. Shapiro then told McCarthy about the threats Heatley mentioned, and she wanted more details. The next day, August 20th, Shapiro met with Heatley to gather them, then called McCarthy back. During that call, he raised his own concern. Heatley's criminal record and leadership role in the case could make the government reject him later. McCarthy gave the first of three key assurances. Being the lead defendant or having a violent past wouldn't automatically disqualify him. Shapiro also asked her to let him know if, during the proffers, it looked like things were going badly so he could try to fix it or walk away. McCarthy agreed to give him a heads up if it wasn't going anywhere, which became the second key assurance. However, she made it clear she wouldn't give ongoing performance updates and that no final decision would come until the proffers were complete. Lastly, McCarthy promised to keep her supervisors informed and involved in the process, Shapiro's third key assurance, because he was worried she didn't have enough authority to close the deal. He took this to mean they'd decide after each session whether to continue, though she never said that outright. Even though they discussed the homicide information Heatley could provide, Shapiro never asked whether that alone would be enough, whether he'd need to give up intel outside of his crew, or what exactly would secure a deal. He also didn't offer a formal attorney proffer, which could have let the government assess Heatley's value before the sessions began. When Shapiro later asked McCarthy what the first meeting on August 21st would cover, she told him it wouldn't just stick to the indictment. Instead, it would be a truthfulness test. starting with events law enforcement already knew to see if Heatley's story lined up. On August 20th, Shapiro pulled up to the MCC to meet with Heatley. This wasn't just a casual chat. Shapiro came with a message. He told Heatley what McCarthy had said earlier. If he wanted any shot at this working, he had to keep it real from start to finish. No sugarcoating, no extra spice, and no leaving out names or details. Full honesty was the ticket. Shapiro laid it out plain. If Heatley wanted a cooperation deal, he had to bring the kind of intel that could help the feds, real information on other people's crimes. Still, Shapiro kept it 100, telling him a deal wasn't guaranteed. Usually these things ended well, but not always. He pointed out that Heatley had heavy knowledge on about 10 or 11 murders, and some of them didn't even touch him directly. The truth was, Shapiro didn't even know the full scope of Heatley's history before that first talk, and he hadn't gone back to study Heatley's post-arrest statement to see if it could be tossed out. But that statement was a problem. It made the trial look like a steeper climb, which pushed Shapiro to greenlight the meeting. The next morning, August 21st, around 10 a.m., Heatley sat down for his first proffer session. In the room were Shapiro, McCarthy, and 2 NYPD detectives. McCarthy handed over the standard proffer agreement, basically a deal saying his words that day couldn't be used directly against him at trial or sentencing, but they could be used to find other evidence or to trip him up if he testified later. The fine print was clear: no side promises, no secret deals, and nothing counted unless it was on paper with signatures. After a quick private talk with Shapiro, McCarthy walked him through the agreement, breaking down the risks. She warned him that signing might kill his chance to testify in his own defense because his words could be flipped back on him. Heatley said he understood, then signed. McCarthy didn't sugarcoat the next part. Cooperating meant telling the government everything he'd ever done and everything he knew about others. Only after a full debrief would they even consider a cooperation agreement. She reminded him again that there were no guarantees. Heatley said he was ready to work with them and asked what it would take. She told him straight, total honesty and serious help to the feds. She also made sure he knew she'd keep her bosses in the loop, promising she wasn't just fishing for info with no real intention of giving him a deal. Heatley went through 5 proffer sessions on August 21st, 23, 27, 28, and 30, spending roughly 20 to 25 hours in total. Before each meeting, he signed the usual proffer agreement, only changing the date each time. The details of what he said aren't the focus here, but 3 things stood out. His statements were mostly self-incriminating. He gave up information on others as well as himself, and much of it tied back to people the government believed were under his control or part of his operation. From the start, U.S. Attorney McCarthy had doubts about his story. Since other sources contradicted parts of it, she made that clear to both Heatley and his lawyer, Shapiro. Shapiro wasn't fazed. He knew prosecutors always push back in these situations. While McCarthy initially questioned whether Heatley was fully owning up to his actions, she did admit he made some progress. Still, by the last session, she felt he hadn't been completely honest or fully accepted responsibility. During their 4th meeting, McCarthy didn't sugarcoat it. If there was going to be a cooperation deal, he was probably looking at a minimum of 20 years behind bars. And even then, she reminded him, nothing was guaranteed. His information would have to be worth more than the weight of his crimes. Shapiro was caught off guard by how blunt she was, but he still kept the sessions going. That same day, Agent Walsh, without McCarthy in the room, asked Heatley for intel that could help flip someone else. Heatley agreed, and Shapiro took this as a sign the government saw him as part of the team. In the 5th meeting, Heatley even encouraged Walsh to pursue other targets. Throughout, McCarthy stayed in close contact with her boss, Glazer, sharing what Heatley said, but also noting when she doubted parts of it. After the 5th session, McCarthy felt most of the valuable information had been exhausted, even if she wasn't convinced Heatley was fully truthful. She wrote a summary memo and passed it up the chain to Glazer, Cohen, Fishbein, and U.S. Attorney Mary Jo White. On September 5th, they met and decided against offering a cooperation deal, instructing McCarthy to stop the sessions. When Shapiro returned from vacation on September 11th, McCarthy told him the offer was dead. The reason? Heatley hadn't given significant new information beyond what they already knew about his crew, and his history made him too risky. Unless he could bring something on people outside his circle, there would be no deal. Then, On November 14, 1996, the Bronx woke up to some jaw-dropping news. 18 members of the notorious Preacher crew had been hit with serious charges, murder, and major drug trafficking. Prosecutors said the crew was behind 11 killings while running a massive crack empire. This indictment didn't just name names. It pulled back the curtain on just how deep they were in the Bronx drug scene and how, despite all that chaos, they'd managed to stay almost invisible to the outside world. Fast forward to January 1997, NYPD and the FBI were tearing apart a Harlem building, chasing whispers that the Preacher crew had turned it into a graveyard. For 3 days, nothing surfaced. But then, on the 5th floor of a rundown city-owned building at 108 Bradhurst Avenue, investigators found the skeletal remains of a woman. She had been shot in the head and dead for months, likely since the crew suspected her of stealing 2 years earlier. By December 17, 1997, the case exploded. A federal indictment slapped Heatley and 11 others with 86 counts of racketeering. Heatley and his right-hand man, Cuff, faced murder, attempted murder, drug conspiracy, firearm possession, and more. Heatley was charged as the boss, the shot caller, in a criminal empire that mixed drugs, robberies, extortion, and death. This made him the first person in New York charged under the federal drug kingpin law, putting the death penalty on the table. The feds announced plans to pursue death for Cuff in January 1998 and for Heatley that August. Then came February 5th, 1999. Heatley folded, pleading guilty to racketeering, 13 murders, and attempted murder, drug dealing, robberies, extortion, and even ordering arson. His lawyers cut a deal with Mary Jo White to take death off the table, trading it for life in prison. Cuff followed suit on March 22nd, pleading guilty to 11 murders, conspiracy to murder, and multiple drug and firearm charges. Finally, on May 14th, Judge Michael B. Mukasey closed the book. Heatley got life plus 225 years. The Preacher crew's reign in the Bronx was officially over,